It was just an old photograph, one of thousands gathering dust in the archives. From 1921, to be exact. At first glance, it didn't seem special. It showed a quiet street scene, probably in some small American town. There was a family, a mother, father, and two kids, standing near what looked like a general store. A few other people walked in the background. The buildings were brick, sturdy and old-fashioned, with big windows. The sky was clear, and the overall feeling was calm, like a postcard from a simpler time. You could almost hear the quiet hum of a summer afternoon, maybe a dog barking in the distance, or the distant clang of a trolley car. It was the kind of picture historians loved to browse, offering a glimpse into everyday life. Nothing dramatic, nothing out of place. Dr. Aris Thorne, a historical archivist with a reputation for meticulous work, was the one who pulled it from its box. He had a systematic way of going through new acquisitions, a calm, almost meditative process of cataloguing each item. He'd seen countless images like this one, faded sepia tones, stiff poses, forgotten faces. He scanned the photo, noting the details for his database: year, estimated location, subjects, standard procedure. His eyes moved across the image, taking in the brickwork, the children's old-fashioned clothes, the faint lettering on the store sign. It was a routine task, one he'd performed thousands of times. Then, something snagged his attention. It wasn't anything obvious, no glaring error or strange object. It was just a small detail, a clock face on a building further down the street, almost lost in the background haze. He paused, his finger hovering over the digital scan. He zoomed in a little, just out of habit, to get a clearer look at the time. He'd often note clock times in photos, useful for dating specific events if other information was missing. He saw the hands pointing. The clock read, unmistakably, 4:15. He frowned slightly, not because 4:15 was a strange time, but because of a feeling, a flicker of something not quite right. He didn't dwell on it, though. He made a mental note and moved on to the next photograph. He had a lot of work to do that day, but the image of that clock lingered, a tiny burr under the saddle of his otherwise smooth routine. Later, as he processed other photos from the same acquisition, his mind kept drifting back to the 1921 street scene. He pulled it up again on his screen. The clock still said 4:15. He checked the shadow angles in the photo. The sun was high, casting short, sharp shadows. This suggested midday, maybe 11 a.m. or 1 p.m. at the latest, depending on the season and the exact longitude. But 4:15? At 4:15, the shadows would be long and stretched, angled differently. This wasn't a subtle difference. It was quite noticeable. He dismissed it quickly. A broken clock, he thought, or maybe someone forgot to wind it, or it was just set wrong. It happened. Not every clock in 1921 was perfectly maintained. It was a simple, logical explanation, nothing to worry about. But the discrepancy, once noticed, refused to fade. It began to nag at him. He found himself thinking about it during his lunch break, and again as he typed up reports. It was a small thing, sure, but Aris had an archivist's mind, one that craved order and consistency. A wrong time on a clock wasn't a huge deal, but it was wrong. It was a tiny crack in the otherwise perfect historical veneer. He decided to do a quick cross-reference just to satisfy the itch. He started pulling other photographs from the same collection, pictures taken in the same general area and around the same year. He found several showing different street views, different activities, and on many of these, there were other clocks, on church steeples, on bank buildings, even pocket watches being held by people. He zoomed in on each one, carefully noting the times displayed. He found clocks showing 9:30 a.m., 11 a.m., 2:40 p.m. All of them seemed to align with the shadow angles in their respective photos, and with what was generally known about daily life and common routines in that era. Then he went back to the original photograph, the one with the family and the general store, the 4:15 clock. He spent nearly an hour just comparing the shadows in that photo to the shadows in the others. There was no doubt. The sun in the 4:15 photo was high, indicating midday. The shadows were short, directly beneath objects, not stretching long to the east or west as they would in the late afternoon. It was impossible for it to be 4:15. The initial dismissal gave way to a growing unease. It wasn't just a broken clock. If it was broken, it would likely be stuck at one time, not just showing a time that sharply contradicted every other visual cue in the picture. And if it was simply set wrong, why would it be that wrong? Several hours off? In a public place where people relied on clocks? It seemed unlikely. He began to feel a prickle of something beyond academic curiosity. The photograph, which had seemed so ordinary, so serenely mundane, now had a faint, unsettling aura. The calm street, the smiling family, they all seemed to exist under the shadow of that impossible clock. The image had shifted in his mind. It was no longer just a historical document. It was a question, a quiet challenge. The serenity of the scene now felt like a facade, barely concealing something that didn't quite fit. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. Dr. Thorne dedicated himself to investigating the photograph's anomaly. He cleared a space on his desk, spreading out printouts of the mysterious image alongside maps of the city from 1921. He pulled up digital archives, searching for local historical records, old newspapers, even weather patterns from that specific week in 1921. He wanted to nail down what the time should have been on that clock. His goal wasn't just to understand the clock's inaccuracy, but to definitively prove it, leaving no room for doubt. He felt a strange pull to the problem, an almost obsessive need to reconcile the image with reality. He started by ruling out the obvious. Was there a known fire or incident that might have stopped the clock at that exact time? No records. Was the area known for having clocks that ran significantly fast or slow? Again, no. He looked up daily schedules for businesses on that street, trying to estimate peak foot traffic times or when shops typically closed. Everything pointed to the photograph being taken sometime in the middle of the day. The sun was too high, the light too bright, the shadows too short for 4:15 p.m. He cross-referenced sunset times for that region in 1921 for the month the photograph was dated. At 4:15 p.m., the sun would have been noticeably lower, casting longer shadows, especially in the cooler months. The photograph's light was clearly from much earlier in the day. Through this meticulous work, Dr. Thorne confirmed his suspicion. The clock in the photograph showed a time several hours ahead of what it should have been. This wasn't a simple 5-minute error or even a half-hour discrepancy. It was a significant chronological shift, at least 2 to 3 hours off, possibly more. The initial easy explanations, a broken clock, a simple setting error, were systematically ruled out. A broken clock would likely be stuck at one time, not consistently showing a time so far removed from the actual moment, while still implying motion. If it was merely set wrong, it was set wrong by an almost deliberate, unsettling margin. This wasn't a casual mistake. It was an outright contradiction of the visual evidence. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling the photograph became. He then shifted his focus to the photograph's provenance. Where did it come from? Who took it? How did it end up in the archives? The information was scant. The photo was part of a larger donation from a private collector, a man who had since passed away, leaving behind a vast and poorly catalogued collection of local historical images. There was no photographer's mark, no date handwritten on the back, just the archive's own cataloging number and a general date based on the style of clothing and the make of a car visible in the background. The lack of clear provenance only added to the mystery, rather than providing answers. It made the photo feel isolated, an inexplicable event without a clear origin story. It was as if it had simply appeared. Feeling he had exhausted his solo efforts, Dr. Thorne decided to present his findings. He called on a small circle of trusted colleagues and photographic experts. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a historian specializing in early 20th century urban life, and Professor Ben Carter, a renowned expert in historical photographic processes, were his first choices. He laid out his evidence: the original photograph, the comparative images with consistent times, the shadow analysis, the sunset data. Their initial reaction was skepticism. Evelyn, always practical, suggested a trick of light, or perhaps a unique local timekeeping custom. Ben, ever the technical mind, wondered if it was a composite image, two photos blended together. But as Dr. Thorne walked them through his meticulous comparison of shadows and light, showing how undeniably high the sun was in the 4:15 p.m. photo, their skepticism gave way to intrigue. He demonstrated that the clock's time simply could not exist in the same instance as the light and shadows depicted. The collective realization that this wasn't a simple historical anomaly, but something deeply unsettling, settled over the room. They checked his calculations, reviewed his comparative photos, and ultimately they agreed. The clock in the photograph showed the wrong time, not by a little, but by a lot, in a way that defied all logical explanation. It was a clear, undeniable contradiction within the image itself. Discussions began about potential explanations. Was it some unique photographic distortion, a flaw in the lens or the film that somehow warped time? Professor Carter meticulously examined the photo for any signs of manipulation or damage, but found none. The image was clear, sharp, and appeared to be a single, unaltered exposure. Could it be a forgotten local time zone oddity, a micro-region that operated on a different clock? Evelyn, with her deep knowledge of local history, confirmed that no such anomaly existed. All records indicated a uniform timekeeping system for the area. The experts were baffled. They couldn't reconcile the clock's time with any rational explanation. The photograph transcended a mere historical artifact. It became a puzzle with disturbing implications. It wasn't just an old picture anymore. It was a physical contradiction, a piece of recorded history that simply made no sense. The quiet, serene image now felt like a paradox captured on film, a moment where the rules of time itself seemed to bend. The more they talked, the more the initial academic curiosity morphed into something else entirely, a shared sense of profound unease. The photo, once a simple document, now felt like a glitch in reality, staring back at them from almost a century ago. The group, now united in their confusion, spent hours poring over the photograph. It wasn't long before Dr. Thorne noticed other, fainter anomalies within the image upon closer inspection. He pointed to a shadow cast by a lamppost, indicating it seemed a little too long for the supposed 4:15 p.m. sun, even accounting for the angle. Then he shifted his focus to the faces of the people captured in the frame. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, but there were tiny distortions, a slight blurring around the eyes of a woman pushing a pram, a man's jawline that seemed a fraction off, as if caught between two expressions. Individually, these details could be dismissed as photographic imperfections, but combined with the clock, they started to paint a different picture. It was as if the very fabric of the scene was slightly out of sync. Driven by the inexplicable nature of these findings, Dr. Thorne decided to explore a less conventional avenue. He began researching local legends and historical anecdotes connected to the building with the clock. He spent days sifting through old town records, forgotten newspaper archives, and even dusty collections of local folklore from the early 20th century. What he uncovered surprised him. There were obscure tales, often dismissed as mere superstition, of temporal disturbances and localized time slips reported around that specific area. One story spoke of a shopkeeper who swore he saw the same customer enter his store twice in a single afternoon, dressed identically but aged differently. Another mentioned a bell tower that occasionally rang out of sync with the town's main clock, only for the discrepancy to vanish moments later. People talked about feelings of sudden dizziness or brief moments where the world seemed to stutter or leap forward, all centered on the old town square where the clock building stood. These stories were previously dismissed as charming, if slightly eccentric, local color. Dr. Thorne started to see eerie parallels between this folklore and the photograph's anomalies. The legends spoke of moments when time seemed to stutter or leap forward, often accompanied by feelings of dread. The shopkeeper's tale, the out-of-sync bell, the sensation of time lurching forward, they all resonated with the photograph's central paradox. The image now felt less like a random error and more like a captured instance of these whispered phenomena. It wasn't just a broken clock, it was a snapshot of a place where time itself might be a little fluid. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty archives. As Dr. Thorne delved deeper, he experienced a growing sense of unease. He felt a strange pull towards the photograph, almost as if it was drawing him in. He would find himself staring at it for long stretches, lost in its details, trying to find another clue, another piece of the puzzle. Subtle occurrences in his own life began to mirror the strange temporal shifts he was investigating. He'd misplace his keys, only to find them in a spot he'd already checked. He'd look at his watch, then look again moments later, and the minute hand seemed to have barely moved. Or sometimes the opposite, an hour would vanish without him noticing. These were minor things, easily dismissed as stress or distraction, but they started to accumulate, creating a psychological tension that gnawed at him. He found himself checking the time constantly, a nervous habit he'd never had before. The initial academic curiosity transformed into something darker. The photo was no longer just an object of study. It felt like a gateway to something unsettling, something that defied the natural order. The whispers from the past were no longer just stories. They felt like warnings, warnings that he was now too deeply entangled in to ignore. He started to feel a profound sense of foreboding, a gut feeling that he was on the edge of uncovering something far more significant and potentially dangerous than a simple historical discrepancy. The image, with its calm facade, had become a source of growing dread, a silent harbinger of something he couldn't yet name. It was as if the photograph held a secret, and that secret was slowly, deliberately, revealing itself to him, one unsettling detail at a time. He couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph wasn't just showing him a past anomaly, but was actively influencing his present. Dr. Thorne expanded his search for similar anomalies, casting a wider net across historical records and photographs from the same region. He wasn't just looking for clocks anymore. He sought any instance of chronological inconsistency, any subtle temporal hiccup that might have been recorded, however briefly or cryptically. He spent long hours poring over old newspapers, personal diaries, shipping manifests, and even church records. His hope was to find a pattern, an explanation, or at least a precedent for the strange behavior of time around the clock building. He knew one single photo could be an outlier, an error, but a collection of small errors might point to something much bigger. His diligent, almost frantic research yielded a handful of other seemingly insignificant discrepancies. He found a diary entry from a local merchant in 1923 that mentioned a delivery arriving a full day before it was dispatched, according to the official ledger. Another archived letter from a woman complaining about her sister's sister's birthday celebration being held on the wrong date, despite the sister insisting it was correct. There was even a brief mention in a town council meeting minute from 1905 about a public clock that inexplicably jumped forward several hours overnight, only to revert to the correct time by morning. These were not as stark or as visually undeniable as the clock in his primary photograph, but they accumulated, suggesting a broader, subtle temporal instability in the area. Each small anomaly, when viewed through the lens of his growing obsession, became a tiny piece of a much larger, unsettling mosaic. They were whispers, yes, but now they were whispers of a chorus, not just a single voice. Dr. Thorne's obsession with the photograph and its implications began to take a serious toll on him personally. The late nights in the archives, the constant mental gymnastics trying to reconcile the impossible, the growing sense of dread, it all chipped away at his usual calm demeanor. He started experiencing minor temporal disorientation in his own life more frequently. He'd leave his office for lunch, convinced he'd only been gone for 20 minutes, only to return and find an hour had passed. Conversations with colleagues felt disjointed. He'd sometimes lose track of what they were discussing, feeling like he'd missed a beat, a sentence, or even a whole topic. He found himself asking people to repeat things, not because he hadn't heard them, but because his mind felt a beat behind, out of sync. His colleagues, initially impressed by his dedication, now noticed his increasing isolation and intensity. His once neatly kept office became a chaotic mess of photocopies, notes, and open books. He'd often forget to eat, or worse, eat the same meal twice, forgetting he'd already had it. His sleep was fractured, haunted by dreams of ticking clocks and shifting shadows. He felt the photograph's presence even when not directly looking at it. It was like a constant hum in the back of his mind, a magnetic pull. The image seemed to subtly change, or perhaps he perceived new details upon each viewing, deepening the mystery. He'd swear a shadow was longer, a face slightly more distorted, a leaf on a tree in a different position. He'd dismiss it as imagination, fatigue, or eye strain, but the feeling persisted. He began to believe the photograph wasn't just showing an anomaly, but causing one. It was a focal point, a kind of temporal beacon that was now affecting his own perception of time. He started keeping it under a cloth when not actively studying it, a futile attempt to lessen its grip on him, but the effect was minimal. The photo had gotten under his skin, into his mind, and it wouldn't let go. The cumulative effect of the research, the personal experiences, and the unsettling folklore created a profound sense of foreboding. The initial academic pursuit had spiraled into a confrontation with something potentially dangerous and beyond human comprehension. He wasn't just studying history anymore, he was living a distorted version of it. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking into an abyss where the rules of reality no longer applied. The ripple effect of the clock's wrong time was spreading, touching not just history but his present. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was just the beginning. The photograph wasn't a static artifact. It was a living, breathing enigma, and its temporal distortion was starting to bleed into his world. He felt like a detective who had stumbled onto a crime scene that was still actively unfolding, a crime against time itself, and he was now a part of it. The wrong time on that clock was not just a curiosity, it was a warning, a silent scream across the decades, and he was the only one who seemed to hear it. He wondered what would happen when the scream finally broke through. The wrong time on that clock was not just a curiosity, it was a warning, a silent scream across the decades, and he was the only one who seemed to hear it. He wondered what would happen when the scream finally broke through. That thought led him to Dr. Anya Sharma, a physicist he'd met years ago at a rather dull interdisciplinary conference. She was known for her work in temporal mechanics, a field many considered theoretical and bordering on science fiction. Dr. Thorne, however, had moved past skepticism. He hoped she could provide a scientific explanation, no matter how outlandish it might seem to a rational mind. He contacted her, speaking in vague terms at first, trying to gauge her openness to truly bizarre phenomena. To his surprise, she was more intrigued than dismissive. She had a reputation for tackling impossible problems, a sort of intellectual daredevil. When Dr. Sharma finally visited the archives, Dr. Thorne presented the photograph with a mixture of apprehension and desperate hope. She was initially skeptical, of course. A wrong clock time in an old photo? She'd seen stranger things attributed to poor photography or simple human error. But as Dr. Thorne laid out his meticulous research, the cross-referenced historical data, the consistent anomalies in other timepieces from that era, and especially the unsettling folklore he'd unearthed, her scientific curiosity began to outweigh her initial skepticism. She asked for access to her specialized equipment, which included advanced photographic analysis tools capable of detecting subtle energy fluctuations and spectral anomalies. Dr. Thorne readily agreed, giving her full rein. Dr. Sharma set up her portable lab, a collection of sensors, high-resolution scanners, and intricate software. She worked methodically, her face a mask of concentration. For days, The archive lab was filled with the soft hum of machinery and the click of keyboards. Then, one afternoon, she called Dr. Thorne over. Her voice was quiet, almost reverent. She pointed to a screen displaying a complex overlay of data on the photograph. "Look here," she said, tapping a section around the clock tower and some of the figures in the foreground. "There's an energy signature. It's incredibly subtle, almost imperceptible, but it's there. It's not just normal photographic decay, and it's not an artifact of the scanning process. It's distinct." Dr. Thorne leaned closer, his heart thumping. The screen showed faint, pulsating patterns, like ripples in water, emanating from specific points in the image. It was an energy he couldn't see with his naked eye, but the instruments clearly detected it. "What kind of energy?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Sharma adjusted a dial. "That's the puzzling part. It doesn't quite fit any known electromagnetic spectrum. It has characteristics of a temporal field, a localized distortion. It's almost as if a moment in time was stretched or compressed, and this photo captured the residual energy of that event." She then pulled up the folklore Dr. Thorne had gathered. She overlaid the energy signature map onto the geographical location of the clock tower, cross-referencing it with the areas described in the old tales of unseen forces and temporal echoes. The correlation was striking. The energy signature seemed to align perfectly with the hotspots mentioned in the legends. "It's like the folklore wasn't just superstition," Dr. Sharma mused, her eyes wide with a new understanding. It was a crude, observational account of a real phenomenon, a localized, contained temporal distortion, perhaps a residual field from an unknown event. "This photograph, Dr. Thorne, it's not just a picture, it's a still frame of that distortion." The implications were staggering. The photograph wasn't just a historical document with a peculiar error, it was a physical manifestation of a temporal anomaly. Dr. Sharma observed that the energy signature wasn't static, it fluctuated subtly, almost like a living thing. She ran new scans, focusing on the changes over short periods. "It's not constant," she explained. "It pulses, it shifts. It's almost like the photograph isn't merely a document of a past event, but a kind of temporal anchor or a window to a moment that exists outside conventional time." This idea sent a shiver down Dr. Thorne's spine. It implied that the anomaly wasn't just a historical footnote, but something that continued to persist, perhaps even interact with the present. The photograph held a secret life, a connection to a temporal event that was still, in some strange way, active. It was no longer just about a wrong time on a clock. It was about a moment in time that refused to be truly past. Driven by this incredible discovery, Dr. Sharma pushed her analysis further. Using advanced spectral analysis, she tried to peel back layers of the image, looking for anything else hidden within its fabric. What she found made both of them gasp. Within the photograph's background, particularly around the edges of the clock tower and in the blurred figures of the onlookers, she identified faint, almost ghost-like impressions. These were not part of the original scene. They weren't the people, the buildings, or the street. They appeared to be superimposed, like faint, translucent overlays, hinting at another presence or dimension intersecting with the depicted reality. They were fleeting, barely there, but undeniably distinct from the rest of the image. It was a glimpse of something else, something that didn't belong. The wrong time on the clock suddenly made horrifying sense. It wasn't a mistake at all. It was a symptom, a visible indicator of something far more profound and terrifying. The clock wasn't just showing an incorrect time for 1921. It was showing a time for a reality that was bleeding into their own, a reality that had briefly touched the world captured in that photograph. The realization hung heavy in the air, a cold, unsettling truth. The photograph was a testament to a moment when the fabric of reality itself had frayed, allowing a glimpse into another temporal existence. And the clock was its silent, screaming witness. The chilling discovery of superimposed impressions within the photograph solidified a terrifying new theory. Dr. Sharma and Dr. Thorne, their voices hushed with a mix of dread and awe, articulated the idea that the photograph was far more than a mere historical artifact. It was not just a record of a past event, but a point of intersection, a fragile membrane where realities briefly touched. The clock's incorrect time, they now believed, was the most obvious manifestation of two distinct realities briefly overlapping within that single, frozen moment. One reality was the familiar, documented world of 1921, the other an unknown, temporally shifted reality that had somehow bled into the scene. This hypothesis cast a new, unsettling light on every detail of the image. They revisited the subtle distortions in the faces of the people captured in the photograph. What they had initially dismissed as photographic flaws, the slight blurring or unnatural expressions, now seemed like something else entirely. Dr. Thorne pointed to a woman near the foreground, her mouth slightly agape, eyes wide, almost as if she were caught off guard by something unseen. "Look at her," he murmured, tracing the faint line lines on the image with a gloved finger. Her expression, it's not just a bad photo, it's a silent horror. Dr. Sharma nodded slowly. They now interpreted these distortions not as technical imperfections, but as the visible strain of individuals existing, however fleetingly, in two temporal realities simultaneously. Their expressions conveyed a silent, uncomprehending horror, a realization of their impossible predicament, a moment of profound confusion as their world momentarily intertwined with another. They were witnesses, perhaps unwilling participants, in a temporal anomaly they could never have understood. As they delved deeper into this unsettling theory, the energy fluctuations detected by Dr. Sharma became more pronounced. The subtle shifts she had observed earlier now seemed to pulse with a more insistent rhythm, almost like a heartbeat emanating from the aged paper. When they were near the photograph, especially during their intense analytical sessions, both Dr. Thorne and Dr. Sharma began to experience more intense temporal disorientations. Minutes would stretch into what felt like hours, or entire blocks of time would vanish from their immediate memory, leaving them feeling profoundly unsettled and disoriented. Dr. Thorne once found himself staring at the wall, convinced only moments had passed, only to look at his watch and discover a full hour had gone by. Dr. Sharma reported vivid dreams that felt like fragmented memories of other times, other lives. Then came the sounds, faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of wind through an old building. They began to hear disembodied sounds. They seemed to emanate directly from the image itself, growing more distinct with each passing day. Sometimes it was a distant murmur of voices, too muffled to understand, yet clearly human. Other times, it was a low, resonant hum, like a forgotten machine operating far away. Once, Dr. Thorne swore he heard the distinct tinny chime of a bell, different from any bell he knew, seemingly coming from the photograph resting on the analysis table. The image, once a static representation of the past, was now actively communicating, echoing with the faint sounds of its intersecting reality. It was as if the boundary between their world and the one captured in the anomaly was thinning, becoming more permeable. This growing sensory experience brought with it a horrifying realization, the threat of contagion. If the photograph was indeed a point of intersection, a place where realities could bleed into one another, then prolonged exposure to it or its emanating energy might lead to the temporal distortion spreading beyond the confines of the image. Dr. Sharma, ever the scientist, theorized about a localized field effect, a temporal resonance that could expand. "We don't know the parameters," she explained, her voice tight with concern. "We don't know if this is a stable intersection or a volatile one. What if the energy field expands? What if it starts affecting the timeline around it, not just within the photograph?" The boundary between realities, once seemingly contained within the photo's frame, felt increasingly fragile, almost like a thin pane of glass that could shatter at any moment. The wrong time was no longer just a curiosity. It was a potential threat, a harbinger of instability that could unravel their own timeline. The photograph, once a static image, now felt undeniably alive, pulsating with an unseen, potent energy. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a phenomenon, a living anomaly. Both experts sensed an imminent shift, a profound and unsettling feeling that the two realities were on the verge of fully converging or diverging through the photo. The faint whispers grew louder, the temporal disorientations more frequent, the energy fluctuations more erratic. The initial academic mystery had escalated into something far more urgent, a desperate race against an unknown temporal disaster. They were no longer merely studying an anomaly. They were standing on the precipice of a breach, a potential tear in the fabric of time itself, and the photograph was the silent, flickering fuse. The calm, everyday scene from 1921 had become a ticking time bomb, its silent clock counting down to an unknown event. Dr. Thorne, his eyes narrowed in a gaze that blended exhaustion with fierce concentration, stared at the photograph. The digital magnification on the screen was so high he could practically count the threads in the subject's clothes. But he wasn't looking at the people, or the street, or the building. He was fixated on the clock, its hands frozen in that impossible position. For weeks, it had been a source of maddening frustration, a symbol of everything that defied logic. But now, as the faint whispers from the photograph grew more insistent, a different kind of thought struck him. What if it wasn't wrong? What if it was just different? He leaned closer, his brow furrowed, trying to strip away all his preconceived notions about time and clocks. He had always assumed the discrepancy was a simple offset, a few hours ahead or behind. But what if the numbers themselves held a deeper meaning? He began to meticulously record the exact position of each hand, converting them into a precise time. It was a time that didn't make sense for any known local or even international time zone of 1921. He scribbled calculations on a notepad, cross-referencing the clock's specific reading with astronomical alignments, historical events, and even obscure meteorological data from the period. He worked through the night, fueled by strong coffee and a growing sense of urgency. Dr. Sharma, observing his intense focus, offered quiet support, occasionally suggesting a new angle for his research, a different database to query. Then a pattern began to emerge. The precise time shown on the clock, when converted into a specific date and even a coordinate, didn't align with anything globally significant. But when he narrowed his focus to the local history of the town where the photograph was taken, a chilling coincidence appeared. It pointed to a date not in their past, but a future one, several decades ahead of 1921. More specifically, it pointed to a date connected to a historically significant but often overlooked event in that very town, a local disaster buried deep in archives, overshadowed by larger national news. It was an event that had caused a significant, though localized, loss of life, and had been surrounded by strange reports of temporal anomalies, small, inexplicable phenomena that had been dismissed as mass hysteria at the time, the very time slips that had been part of the local legends he'd uncovered earlier. The realization hit Dr. Thorne with the force of a physical blow. The clock wasn't showing the wrong time at all. It was showing a different time, a time from the intersecting reality, or even more terrifying, a warning from it. The people in the photograph, their faces distorted not by photographic flaw, but by the strain of existing in two temporal realities simultaneously, weren't just victims of an anomaly. They were messengers, frozen in that impossible temporal overlap. They were trying to communicate the significance of this specific time, this specific date, this specific event. Their silent horror was not just for their own predicament, but for what that time represented. The true horror of the photograph began to reveal itself. The experts understood that the image captured a moment when the temporal fabric was stretched thin, allowing a glimpse through to a potential future or an alternate past. The wrong time on the clock was a dire prediction, a timestamp for a catastrophic event that either occurred in an alternate timeline or was yet to occur in theirs. It was a moment of profound temporal chaos, caught and preserved. The anomaly wasn't just a curiosity, a fascinating historical puzzle. It was a message, a screaming, silent warning embedded in an everyday scene. The casual serenity of the photograph now felt like a cruel deception, a thin veil over a horrifying truth. Dr. Thorne and Dr. Sharma stood in the lab, the silence heavy between them, punctuated only by the faint, unsettling whispers from the photograph. They were burdened with a terrifying knowledge, a secret ripped from the fabric of time itself. They understood that the clock was a silent scream, a frozen warning from a moment of temporal chaos. The photograph was no longer just a mystery, it was a prophecy, and they were its reluctant recipients. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on them, heavy and cold. They had sought answers, and they had found them, but the truth was far more disturbing than any theory they had conceived. The everyday photo had become a harbinger, its message delivered across decades, a stark omen of a future event, or perhaps a past one that had rippled through time. The implications were staggering, stretching beyond their understanding of physics, history, and reality itself. The photograph, once a simple archival piece, now held the power of a dark, impossible revelation. Faced with the profound and terrifying implications of the photograph, Dr. Thorne and Dr. Sharma knew they had to make a decision, a choice that would shape their future, and perhaps the future of others. What could they do with this knowledge? How could they possibly warn the world about a temporal anomaly captured in a century-old photograph? The potential for widespread panic, for immediate disbelief, or for utter misunderstanding was immense. They considered going public, presenting their findings to the scientific community, but the sheer absurdity of their discovery would likely lead to ridicule, not action. No one would believe that a faded image held the key to an impending temporal disaster. They felt a crushing responsibility, a silent burden that only they understood. Their immediate priorities shifted to containing the photograph's influence, preventing the temporal distortion from spreading further. They couldn't risk the anomaly infecting other artifacts or, worse, other people. They implemented strict protocols for its storage and viewing. The photograph was moved to a specially constructed containment unit, a lead-lined vault deep within the archive, shielded from any external electromagnetic or temporal interference they could devise. Access was restricted to only the two of them, and even then, only under carefully controlled conditions. It was treated as a highly dangerous artifact, a silent, ticking time bomb, even though it was just a piece of paper. The photo was locked away, but its presence, its silent hum of wrongness, was always felt, a constant pressure on their minds. Dr. Thorne and Dr. Sharma were profoundly changed by their encounter with the photograph. The casual academic curiosity that had first drawn Dr. Thorne to the image was long gone, replaced by a deep-seated unease. Dr. Sharma, the pragmatic physicist, now carried a weight of understanding that transcended her scientific training. They carried the burden of the wrong time, the knowledge of intersecting realities, and the chilling prophecy embedded within that faded image. Their perception of time, reality, and history was irrevocably altered. Every clock they saw seemed to mock them. Every news report of a minor local incident made them wonder if it was another ripple from the photograph's timeline. They saw the world through a new, unsettling lens, a world far more fragile and unpredictable than they had ever imagined. Within their specialized scientific community, the photograph became a legend, whispered about in hushed tones, its true nature known only to a select few who had glimpsed Dr. Thorne's early research. It served as a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that lie beyond human comprehension and the unsettling fragility of their perceived reality. They crafted vague reports, hinting at an unusual temporal signature in an archival piece, enough to justify its deep storage without revealing the full, terrifying truth. It was a secret that haunted them, a silent testament to a moment when time itself fractured, leaving an indelible mark on their lives. They tried to move on, to return to their normal research, but the shadow of the clock's wrong time followed them. Years passed. Dr. Thorne eventually retired, his hair grayer, his eyes holding a distant, knowing look. Dr. Sharma continued her work, always with a subtle edge of caution, a quiet understanding of the unseen. The photograph remained in its vault, undisturbed, a sealed secret. But the question lingered, always. Perhaps the wrong time in the photograph wasn't wrong at all. Perhaps it was the correct time for a reality that now subtly influenced their own. The thought was a nagging itch in the back of their minds, a final, unsettling echo of the anomaly. What if the event predicted by the clock had indeed happened, not in their direct timeline, but in a parallel one that was now bleeding into theirs? What if the subtle temporal shifts they sometimes felt, the fleeting moments of déjà vu, the inexplicable delays or accelerations in their daily lives, were not just their imaginations, but persistent echoes from that other reality? The photograph, even in its secure vault, seemed to exert a silent, pervasive influence. They had contained the physical object, but could they contain the knowledge, the fear, the possibility it represented? The lingering question was terrifying. What other hidden temporal anomalies existed, waiting to be discovered, waiting to reveal their terrifying truths? The clock's wrong time was just the beginning. It was a crack in the facade of their understanding, a tiny glimpse into a universe far more complex and dangerous than they could ever fully grasp. And that thought, that silent, unsettling whisper of endless possibilities, was the true legacy of the photograph. It had opened their eyes to a reality where time was not a straight line, but a tangled, unpredictable web, and they were merely observers, forever marked by the moment they saw the clock show the wrong time, and realized it might be the right one after all.